I was thinking about what games to cover this week. It dawned on me that I have not shown the Big 12 enough love over the past couple weeks, so I figured it'd be fitting to talk about the Big 12 a little bit more. The last episode I did was when I talked about UCF versus Colorado, a game I was clearly wrong about. Obviously, if you go and watch that video, I have a bunch of people, hating on me and whatnot, but we're back and we're going to be discussing the Big 12 in particular. I think it's really fitting to talk about this BYU Cougars program. I mean, you know, I watched them the week before versus Arizona, and I also watched the thriller ending versus Oklahoma State as well. Which to be honest, when I was watching the end of that game, Ollie Gordon was finally going. Alan Bowman comes off the bench and plays well enough to get his team in a position to be able to win the game, but once again, Oklahoma kind of lets it slip away once again, a la the Arkansas game back in week 1 too. It kind of was deja vu all over again for Oklahoma State. But watching this BYU program over the past couple weeks and this season, I gotta say these guys are so much fun to watch. I mean, it's head coach Sataki too. He's about to be on his, I believe, 10th season at BYU, and for the most part they've been pretty much a winning program pretty consistently. And his roots, dig back all the way. He was assistant at Southern Utah. He was assistant coach at the University of Utah for a number of years before making the change over to BYU. And he's just, although I'll admit, I watched, some of his press conferences and his interviews. He's not certainly not the most exciting person to listen to or anything like that. But at the same time, too, I think there was a little bit of pressure from, BYU fans in general for this program to finally take the next step. I mean, yes, they've had some winning seasons and a handful of bowl wins or something like that, but we've never seen them be in contention for the Big 12 or even going back to the Mountain West before they went over in 2020. But this program's been fun to watch for a number of reasons. I think first and foremost, the number one thing that we need to give them credit for is they find multiple reasons to win. I mean, they're 7-0 right now. They're, on the cusp of being a top 10 team, assuming they win this, if they win this weekend, traveling on the road versus UCF, which, I'll articulate in a little bit and preview that game. But, right now as it stands, I mean, BYU currently is in first place in the Big 12, and if the season were to end today, they would face Iowa State Cyclones, who are another really strong, underappreciated team under head coach Matt Campbell over there, and they definitely deserve some love too. And hey, if you know anybody who covers Iowa State pretty extensively, I'd love to have them on the program and be able to talk some Cyclone football. I'd always appreciate that too. And going into this program, I mean, you know, I think to myself as I was watching the BYU game, there's been so many highs and lows with this team. I mean, you think about the ass whoopings that they put on, Arizona and Kansas State, and then meanwhile they have comeback wins versus Baylor and and also at SMU as well. So when you think about this team, one of the things I think you really have to give them a lot of credit for is they find multiple ways to win. I mean, obviously, the Oklahoma State game, it really came down to Jake Radsliff, kind of really putting the team on his back and just being a gamer. And what I mean by a gamer is someone who, was taking shots down the field, willing to take chances, not afraid to get hit, getting up again, and quite frankly, just being able to extend the plays just enough for his receivers to get open in the most critical moments too. And he does deserve a lot of credit going into this season right now. This season he's 121 for 205, 1,600 passing yards, 16 touchdowns with 7 interceptions. And also, fun fact, he's also the leading rusher of this team with 265 yards and 2 touchdowns too. So 18 combined touchdowns on the season and in 7 games this season. And it's definitely a stark contrast to the BYU team from last year in terms of BYU averaged approximately 23 points on offense compared to this year. It's an astonishing 34. which definitely goes to show that they've made a ton of improvements on this team. And I think the biggest thing that I've been seeing is I think the pass protection's been pretty solid, all things considered. I mean, when you when you sit down and think about it, I mean, nobody was talking about BYU this year. I mean, I'll go as far back to 4 months ago, and I was saying to myself, you know what, you have Kyle Whittingham, who is a phenomenal coach, a leader of men, somebody who, you can just get behind, and somebody who you always want to see win. And it kind of felt like, yes, they've had all that success against USC in the Pac-12 and all that, but part of me felt like just them going to the Big 12, it just felt natural for Utah to, kind of run away with the Big 12 and hopefully get one last conference title and possibly a college football run before Winningham calls it quits. But with the Cam Rising injury and the offense is looking so anemic that it just, they're obviously not really in contention for the Big 12 or or much, perhaps not even making it to a bowl game. But we'll see how they cross that bridge. But you know, and give the defense some props too. I mean, they definitely some games where they've had some slow starts. I go back and think to that Baylor game where you know I even previewed Baylor too if you want to check that out. What I did a couple months ago. But the one thing about Baylor too is you were so worried about how much that offense was really going to get going too. And Dave Arnada, his specialty was defense, but yet they did lose a lot of players via the transfer portal too. And they are having a solid showing this year. I mean, they beat Texas Tech, and they ultimately fell apart in the second half against BYU. But it's really just a testament to this team and also the leadership there as well. And you know, it's one of those things too where it almost feels fitting for BYU to finally be in a position of being in that, sort of conference championship picture. I mean, it's not that BYU's ever been, necessarily a bad program. It's just they've always just been kind of a good program in the sense of, hey, for a while, Sataki was in that 8 to 10 win range, and that for all things considered, for everyone and and Bravo, hey, that's a victory. But at the same time, you almost have to ask yourself, when can this team take the next step? And you know, everything right now seems to be in line to the extent of, that they can. I mean, as I look at the BYU schedule for the rest of the season, you're on the road versus UCF, then you're on the road versus a struggling Utah team. Then you play Kansas, who's definitely been one of the more disappointing teams in the Big 12. But it seems like last week they did get a big win versus Houston, and Jaden Daniels had not Jaden Daniels yeah, Daniels had a pretty clean game, all things considered. Then they traveled to Arizona State, and they finished the year versus Houston. So there definitely are some wins there. I don't think they're going to win out. There probably is going to be a game there where they possibly lose to, maybe they get upsetted versus a UCF or an Arizona State or something like that on the road. But you know this team right now has all the makings at the very least of being in the Big 12 championship. Because when I look at this going forward, right now it's really a four-team race. You have BYU, you have Iowa State, you have Colorado, and you have Cincinnati. In terms of actual just general talent, I think Cincinnati is a little bit further behind in terms of being able to kind of be in that picture. I do think and Scott Soddenfield deserves a lot of credit for even being in that picture right now, because they've made an incredible transformation this season. And they're if they get one more win, they'll be in a bowl game. And quite frankly, if I were them, that's a great season. So I don't necessarily put them in the same pillar as Colorado and Iowa State. However, when you look at this moving forward, I mean, good thing for BYU is they do avoid Colorado, which is good news, because I think the one thing as I've talked about, as I've kind of progressed in terms of talking about Colorado, is I was definitely a critic of Colorado at the beginning. I did not give them enough credit for what they've done. But the one thing I did always say about Colorado is, Shador Sanders is the real deal. You're utilizing Travis Hunter in the right way. And Pat Shermer is really an underrated play caller, too. Yes, people give him shit for, his stints with the Browns and the Giants and all that too. But he has such an extensive background, also being an offensive coordinator as well. It was really smart for Deion Sanders to pick a guy like Pat Shermer, who he doesn't necessarily have to worry so much about calling offensive plays. He lets Shermer do his thing, helps him out in recruiting, in the transfer portal a little bit on the recruiting trail, and also pretty much served as his quarterback coach too. So it just seems like a win-win there all around. And also, give Colorado a shout out for, with Livingston too, or Robert Livingston too, defense coordinator over there, young talented coach, and it's gone to show that they've definitely made some adjustments this year in terms of getting this team together. I mean, they were definitely known for giving up a lot of really big plays down the field and a secondary that has definitely looked vulnerable at times. But you see this Colorado team definitely kind of coming together too. But I would definitely be intrigued if it somehow were to be a BYU Colorado Big 12 championship game. Now, I would probably say at the moment, I would probably picture Iowa State to be in that picture more than Colorado. But in terms of the matchup in general, I think if you're kind of transitioning back to BYU versus UCF that's coming up this week, if you're BYU, I think you have two main concerns. I think, first and foremost, I mean, UCF played Iowa State really tough last week. They lost 38-35. That rushing attack was finally got going. And, now that they benched KJ Jefferson now, it seemed like it was a legitimate spark to the point where, it was time for Gus Malzahn to make some changes. And, he's one of those coaches where, you can never count him out regardless of where he is in the standings. And I'll tell you this: if BYU takes this game lightly, I've talked about UCF at the beginning of this season. If they take this lightly, I could see this definitely being a game that they possibly get upsetted in. Because when you look at this match on paper, I would say one of the general criticisms that I've noticed about BYU in general is I think they not only have struggled to run the ball, but I think they've struggled defensively, stopping the run as well. And when you have the three-headed monster that UCF has, if RJ Harvey gets going, I could see this being kind of a dangerous matchup for BYU in that sense, because if they can't stop the rushing attack and UCF can really control the time of possession. I mean, no matter how much you have Ratsliff on the field, I mean, you can't it could turn into one of those games where it ends up being another kind of similar shootout that we saw last weekend. And at the same time, too, it definitely will be a serious test for them that I think, quite frankly, BYU kind of needs in this moment. Because yes, they have a really strong resume at the moment. You beat an Arizona team that, quite frankly, has underachieved this year in their first year under Coach Brennan. You have a K State team who's still in the who's still ranked in the top 20 with a lot of young talent such as Avery Johnson and a lot of key playmakers there. And you beat a solid. And you also beat SMU right now, who's also ACC team who's ranked in the top 20. So the resume is certainly there for them to, possibly even make an outside bid if they were to not win the Big 12. But if at the same time, if you are a team like Alabama, Tennessee, Ole Miss, in theory, you really want to hope that BYU, go runs the table and goes undefeated. Because let's say if BYU, loses once, and then Iowa loses once too, you know, that's going to be a really tough discussion in terms of, do you keep out that BYU and Iowa State in favor of an Alabama or Georgia who's played tougher teams? Or do we kind of make up for the wrong that Florida State had last year, and finally do the right thing and say, you know what, wins and losses and conference championships need to matter. I mean, that's the one criticism that I have consistently have had about college football is I think a lot of people tend to overlook actually winning your conference and having a good conference record. I'll be I'll die on that hill saying that is that it needs to freaking matter that your conference champions, and even just being there too. I mean, obviously it's a little different if you get your ass whooped and lose by 40. I'm not necessarily saying that, but for you to have a 12 win season and go 12-0 or 11-1 and then for you to sit there and say, well, we're going to put Tennessee or Alabama in, who ends up going 10-2 and 9-3. I definitely imagine it being one of those conversations that we're going to end up having in terms of this BYU program. But you know, again, Sataki, 68-41. You know, been there since 2015. You really have a BYU team who's, you know, really there on all cylinders, who's really firing on all cylinders. You know, putting up a lot of points, defense doing just enough to win, and they're being creative, and they're finding different ways to win. And when you look at this moving forward, you have got that going for you. You have a really strong quarterback who, you can trust in those pivotal moments too. And most importantly, just like I articulated here, they have a very manageable schedule, moving forward too. And I don't necessarily think they even have to go undefeated. I mean, ideally, if you do go undefeated and you go on to win the Big 12 championship, hey, you have all the momentum in the world, and possibly in the first playoff game, you have a really strong home game in at Lavelle Edwards Stadium, which should be rocking too. And I think a lot of people who were following BYU back in their national title run in 1984 would certainly be freaking excited for that. So as I articulated before, look for this BYU team to make some noise, and keep watching this Big 12 conference here. I said at the beginning of the season that they would definitely be by far the closest conference, and definitely the most competitive too. And there's just so many even teams that it could definitely go a number of different directions. But I'm excited to see how it turns out.